Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Stuart with the Samuel Watershed Care. Grateful that you guys came out to take this in. We had a real good meeting this morning over in Boston. So with that being said, welcome. We'll get started. I just want to do some introductions quick. Here, but Samuel Board, I'm just Craig Engelstad, manager.
Sean.
Sean, I'm coming up from the heat.
Well, that was a good time over there.
Yeah. Also, April Swemby, our administrator for the Sand Hill Watershed. Zach Herman, our engineer for the Sand Hill Watershed. We also have representation from Hull County, Paul Reese, and we have Rich Sanders, county engineer. It's a joint meeting today, but it is a meeting under the Sand Hill Watershed, so I'll call that meeting to order and we'll proceed with that. So.
Thank you, Mr. President. For now.
John Cole, sorry,
Thank you.
our engineer.
Welcome, everybody, and we'll try to keep this moving along, try not to bore anyone. I'm an attorney. I do drainage work across the state. I have an engagement with the Sand Hill River Watershed District to give it advice in its capacity as a drainage authority for public drainage system. And was asked to come today to talk about generally the drainage authority's obligations to the system and how that might affect some decisions that are pending to be made, potentially related to both the Sand Hill ditch and other ditches that are that are higher up in the watershed that are under the authority of Polk County. No decisions are going to be made today. This is really just an informational meeting for all of the landowners, so you know kind of what's under consideration and how that might impact you as a landowner within the watershed area that drains to the Sand Hill ditch. I'm going to get started. You're welcome to ask questions at any point along the way. To the extent I can answer them, I will. And if there's things that are left out there confused, it's still confused, I'll stay around afterwards and we'll see if we can't work through those things. A lot of this information you probably already know. If you've been in agriculture for a minute and you've been draining land for a minute, you know that there's a whole body of law related to that, both on the restrictive side from your regulatory compliance to the cost side related to public drainage systems. So if I'm going over things that you already know, I apologize for that, but we'll just get right to it. Let's talk about what is a public drainage system. And I have that in quotes because it's a bit of a misnomer. This is not truly public in terms of it's everybody's. This is public in terms of it is managed by a public authority. So public drainage systems, they exist all over the state. They can be open ditches, they can be tiles, they can be combinations of buried tile and open ditch. But they have to have a few things in common for them to be under the public drainage law, which is a specific body of statute in Minnesota. They have to be established by a public body, and they have to be administered by a public body, and they have to be paid for by assessment to benefited lands. So back in the day, there were all kinds of different ways to establish these ditches. The state had a drainage commission back at, between the 18 and 1900s that established drainage systems. The courts were authorized to establish drainage systems. Townships were authorized to establish drainage systems. Counties were authorized to establish drainage systems. After 1947, all of that was consolidated under a single drainage code, and all of the authority vested in counties or joint county boards. So if a system was in 2 or more counties, meaning it had benefited property in 2 or more counties, there had to be a joint board because no single county had the authority to tax across the county line. So they had to form a joint board for that purpose. As of 1955, with the advent of the watershed law and the establishment of various watershed districts were also authorized to be drainage authorities. And those they could be drainage authorities either in the initial instance by a petition for a project or by transfer of that system to the watershed district. Here's what the courts have said. What's the purpose of our drainage law? The purpose of our drainage law is to reclaim wet and overflowed land and to fairly allocate the cost of doing so. So I want you to imagine all the way back to statehood in the mid 1800s. And the settlers coming to this territory and realizing how much water there was, and the state's motivation to try to drain some of that off so that more settlers could come and things could be productive. And we have a little video that details a little bit of that history that we'll look at in between the two presentations. So I'm going to talk about the drainage code part of things and what the obligations of the drainage authority are under the law. And then we have a viewer from a viewing organization, Brian Murphy. He's going to talk about how their team does the viewing and determines these benefits. And that's all part of that fair allocation of costs. So there's a ditch that could be in the Sandhill River Watershed District for all I know. It's got a buffer area, it's got a main channel, there's vegetation, and it appears to have water flowing in it. So what's a drainage authority? Well, we talked about that. Currently, drainage authorities are either the county board, a joint county board, or a watershed district. And it all depends on who has the responsibility for administering the system. So again, it's public in the sense that there's a public entity that administers the system for the benefit of the landowners that either utilize the system as an outlet for drainage or put a burden upon that system. So the drainage authority has been recognized by courts as having a certain role. The drainage authority is the entity that is solely responsible for implementing the drainage code and for asserting the rights of the benefited landowners. So benefited landowners, if you pay an assessment to a ditch, you have a right to have that ditch system maintained so that it serves generally its original purpose. Now, we understand that there's all kinds of changes that occur in the landscape since an original establishment of the ditch that put additional burdens on the ditch. And that's one of the things we're going to talk about today is how do you account for that and make sure that that cost, all of those costs related to a system are fairly allocated. And we talk about the rights that are associated with drainage systems. Once a landowner is assessed for the construction of a system, that landowner now has a property right. Part of the little bundle of sticks, they have a right to drain or to access that system, to drain toward that system and use it as an outlet for drainage. And that second part of the bullet up there is really important. The landowner is entitled to all the conditions upon which the ditch was established. So a little bit about this Fisher case. Fisher was a farmer, south central Minnesota, and the township was planning to pull out some culverts in the township road. And Fisher said, can't pull those culverts out because they are what allows my drainage to leave my property and get to the drainage system for which I was assessed. And the court came back and said, Mr. Fisher is right. Mr. Fisher is entitled to have those culverts there because without them, the basis of his benefits, the conditions upon which that system was established, are impeded. And so the township would have had to have bought his drainage rights back from him in order to remove those culverts. So it's all about kind of watching out for those rights and obligations on the drainage system. And if I had to boil it down, the drainage authority really has two primary responsibilities, and then there's some subsets. So the first one is protect that drainage right. So I'm a landowner, I've got a right to access the ditch for drainage or to place a burden on that because I paid for its construction or its upkeep and maintenance. So number one, we're going to protect that drainage right. What does that entail? It entails keeping the system in a state of repair, preventing damage. So, making sure that the neighbor doesn't come in and tape a bunch of soup cans together and create a crossing and then obstruct the ditch, or making sure that they don't dump all their field rock or field stones into the ditch, or making sure that they don't roll all their round bales into the ditch and then they clog up the culverts. That's the kind of damage we're talking about. Prevent unauthorized use. That's intended to say if somebody is using the ditch or putting a burden on the ditch and hasn't paid or isn't paying. This is about that idea of everybody needs to pay if they're going to utilize the ditch as an outlet or put a burden on the ditch. And then that flows right into this idea about everybody's fair share. And this is important because a lot of the drainage systems that we're talking about in this part of the state were established decades ago. The Sandhill ditch, for example, very near to the establishment of the drainage of the watershed district. So in about the 1950s, 1956, and it was established actually as a federal flood damage reduction or flood control project, and then was turned over as a drainage system to the watershed district as the local responsible entity for its ongoing maintenance. And we'll talk a little bit about how a flood control project can actually also be a drainage project in terms of how it protects the lands from overflow. And then that second obligation is to balance the interests. So anytime we go to spend any money on a drainage system, no matter where you are in the state, everybody's saying, well, I don't need it. I don't want it. I don't want to have to pay for it. And that is a consideration, although it's not the primary consideration of a drainage authority. A drainage authority needs to look at and say, what's in the best interest of the system as a whole? And in many cases, it's in the interest of the system as a whole to maintain it or to maybe reconstruct it. In some cases, it's working fine. And even though it might look ugly, like if you look at the screen there with all the trees growing up next to the ditch, that ditch is still functioning. It doesn't need a lot of work. And so somebody might look at that and say, well, all those trees should be taken out. Everything should be planted with grass. But again, if it's not affecting drainage benefit, then it might not be in the interest of the system to do any work whatsoever. So that's part of that balancing of interest. And then if you can, as you can imagine, since the original establishment of many of these systems, a lot of laws have changed regulating what you can and can't do with your land. And especially true if it's wetland or wetlands. If you're enrolled in the federal farm program, you've got swamp buster. You can't drain a wetland that was on the property as of December 23rd, 1985. If it's after 1991, the Wetland Conservation Act, that's a state law. That restricts your ability to drain. After 1972, under federal law under the Clean Water Act, you can't discharge dredge or fill material into the waters of the United States or bring about a change to the wetlands adjacent to those waters without creating a violation or a regulatory problem. And there's all kinds of other laws. After 1979, if it's a public water course or public water wetland, the state regulates that as well. So what people that were allocating costs on a drainage system thought could be achieved back in 1950 and had benefits assigned based on that, it might be that no longer can be achieved. And so we end up with a situation where because of all these changes, the benefits themselves, the distribution of those benefits are out of whack. And we're going to talk about those benefits in a little bit more detail in just a few slides. So we talk about this obligation to protect that drainage benefit and to keep the system in a state of repair. Here's what the statute says. It says that after the ditch is constructed, the drainage authority has an obligation. It shall inspect and it shall maintain. So it can't just ignore the system, even though that happens all over the state all the time. It has to at least make some effort to understand what the condition of the ditch is and then maintain it when those conditions are such that it impairs that level of function or that level of benefit. And here's a little bit more about what does that mean? It means restoring that hydraulic efficiency. So if a ditch was constructed to drain 1 inch of water off the landscape, the watershed area landscape in a 24-hour period, but somebody put a small culvert in or the side slopes have caved in and now it's holding water back and it's not providing that level of hydraulic efficiency, then according to the code, it needs to be repaired. And so in the process of repairing, there's a lot of different things that a drainage authority can do. It can flatten side slopes if that is required for more stability. If it does that, it has to pay damages for more physical occupation of the system. It can realign the system to either avoid a wetland or maybe make the system more stable or less damaging. So there's a lot of different things that can occur under the guise of a repair. So this is what the courts have said about that obligation to repair. And then this is what the courts have also said about that balancing of interests. So when we talk about balancing those environmental interests, this is what the court said. It says you can't just go out and do whatever you want. You have to do that in recognition of these other laws that might restrict what you're doing and also to look at what is the impact of resources. And here's where there's a bit of a difference between counties as a drainage authority and a watershed district as a drainage authority. Counties have no legal mandate to really nurture or conserve the environment. They might have a motivation to do so, but counties as drainage authorities are really more concerned with what's the economic impact of, being able to have robust agriculture and those sorts of things. Whereas a watershed district considers that, but also has a legal mandate by the state legislature to look at the conservation of specific resources and to look at those. So again, the courts have said, well, all of that needs to be reconciled. It doesn't matter if you're a county drainage authority or a watershed district drainage authority, all of that needs to be reconciled. A little bit about preventing unauthorized use. There are provisions in the code that say if I'm doing a repair and the engineer looks at the watershed and says, these 10 people over here are utilizing the ditch as an outlet for drainage and they're not paying. Well, then we pause those proceedings and we pull those folks in. And that's part of that allocation of costs and making sure everybody's paying their fair share.
Sean,
Yes,
I've seen in benefited areas where you'll have people paying benefits and then in the middle of a parcel that isn't, because they either paid something up front when the ditch was being built or whatever. Does that get fixed with this, or does that go on forever?
nope, it would get fixed as part of this process. And we talk about what the viewers are obligated to do is they look at all the property within the watershed area that drains to the drainage system, and they have to determine benefits on all of those properties. What I have found over 26 years of doing this is that that parcel belonged to a county commissioner way back in the 1930s when the ditch was established, and that's how they avoided paying benefits. And I know that's a cynical way to look at it, and I apologize to any county commissioners who are in the room, but I've seen that happen all over the state. And, you know, these are stories that, I mean, most of them are true. Some of them are just good for illustration. It may also be that, you know, back in the day that benefits were determined, that property didn't have any wet acres. The other thing we noticed is that, as the statute has developed, we were supposed to look at 40-acre parcels, which everybody had 40-acre parcels, 40 acres and a mule, right? Or whatever the homestead area was. And Brian will talk about this in some more detail, but oftentimes it was just the wet acres, but if you had one wet acre on a 40, the whole 40 was considered to be benefited. And it might have been benefited this much, whereas the neighbor next door might have had 10 wet acres and it might have been benefited this much. But the way that those old logs read out, that whole 40 is weak, when in fact it was only those few acres that were wet at the time. So there's a lot of reasons why there are gaps on a lot of those maps. And a lot of it just has to do with viewing process, has to do with what was considered to be a benefited land. Even today, when the viewers go out and they look at properties, they're gonna identify properties that simply aren't benefited. They can't, their water doesn't get to the ditch, or it's a wetland area that can't be converted. And with the specific example of the watershed that flows to the Sandhill Ditch, Brian will give you some examples of what we call non-contributing basins, which would be considered non-benefited. Here's another provision related to unauthorized use. Technically, if I'm not in the benefited area, I've never paid benefits, and I install a drainage system, maybe it's tile with a lift pump, maybe it's surface drains, that puts a burden on the downstream ditch. In theory, the drainage authority is supposed to catch that, stop me from doing it, force me to apply to a proceeding under the drainage code for permission to do that outlet, and then I've got to pay an outlet fee and have a future benefit assigned. The reality is that rarely happens, because a lot of this, it's a big countryside, and a lot of this work happens, not going to say under the moonlight, but often it happens under the moonlight, and nobody sees it until after it's done, and it doesn't matter how much the downstream neighbors complain, we just can't catch up on it. And so part of the way we pull these properties in, if we don't catch them at the time, is through that process where the engineer assigns an area during a repair that's going to be brought in and viewers are adopted, or we pull them in through this process. Well, not this process. This is about what you consider when you're going to try to outlet. But under this process, which is if we think the benefited area is different than what was originally determined, or the land uses have changed such that those lands are taking a different type of advantage of the ditch's construction than was originally considered by viewers, and again, we're talking about decades and decades ago, then the drainage authority has the discretion to initiate what's called a redetermination of benefits. And it's really just a reallocation. And they have to have made a finding that the benefited areas have changed, the land use, the nature and distribution of benefits have changed, or it could be as simple as the land values have changed. And you can imagine, for the Sandhill Ditch as an example, between the 1950s and today, land values have certainly changed. Farming practices have certainly changed. Drainage practices have certainly changed. Regulatory restrictions on certain uses of property have certainly changed. And so all of that now has the ability to be accounted for through a process called redetermination of benefits. And that's one of the things that's under consideration by both the watershed board as to the Sandhill ditch and the Polk County Board of Commissioners as to other ditches that are within the overall watershed that flows to the Sandhill ditch, where there are other drainage systems in the upper basin. And again, Brian's got some maps and he'll kind of go through and show where those things are. Yes, sir.
Just at, like the tiling scenario we laid out there, looking how upstream for added benefit or receivers, would it be looking at anything within the watershed, or say you would tile a field that's in watershed A and your outlet goes in watershed B? Is that the scenario under which it'd be assessed? Or if you're 2-3 watersheds upstream from it and then adding more water to it?
Brian's gonna go over that in detail in terms of the viewing, but the short answer is a lot of that gets accounted for during this process. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to identify everybody that either benefits economically because the ditch serves as an outlet for their drainage, or is utilizing their land in a way that puts a burden on the ditch and creates a cost on that ditch. Or maybe the ditch prevents their land from being overflowed, and that's really the scenario for a lot of the benefits for the Sandhill ditch. Like I said, it was constructed originally as a federal flood control project because water coming off the beach ridge would then come down into this flat plain, just to the east of the Red River, and would spread out and break out and go off to the northwest. And then when the Sandhill ditch was constructed, a lot of that flow was then confined to the ditch and carried in a more efficient and direct manner to the Red River. So we do pick a lot of that up. So what constitutes a drainage benefit? We already, oh, I'm sorry, sir.
Just, it seems like the previous paragraph, it says if the drainage authority determines that, they may, but it doesn't say shall. Other areas in the statute, you read about their obligations, it seems like it suggests they shall do it.
Right, and this gets to that obligation of ensuring a fair share. Right? Really what the drainage authority wants to do is it wants to do what's in the best interest of the system. And it's in the best interest of the system to ensure that everyone that's creating a cost on that system or is benefited by that system, either they place a burden on it or they use it as an outlet or they're protected by that system, that everybody's paying a share of the costs. And that's really what we're talking about here is we're talking about going out, looking at that watershed, finding out where those burdens come from, you know, how the drainage patterns are working, and trying to actually make sure that everybody that has a stakeholder, has a stake in the ditch, is paying at least a portion of, the cost of providing the service that the ditch provides. So the viewers, if you're gonna do that redetermination of benefit process, they're required to look at the entire watershed of the drainage area that flows to the system, to the ditch system. In the case of the Sandhill ditch, it lies at the bottom of a very, very, very large watershed. And then in the upper portions of that watershed, there are all kinds of other county ditches that flow into a natural system that then flows into the Sandhill ditch that then gets carried to, all of that burden gets carried to the Red River. And if we had people that lived upstream on the Red River, or downstream on the Red River, they would say, well, we don't like the Sandhill ditch because it floods us out. But really, that's not what they were concerned about when they built the Sandhill ditch. They were really just concerned about protecting the area adjacent to it. So we have this idea about a benefit being first hydrologic, and this is where the engineer comes in. The engineer has to look at what are all the properties that put a burden on this ditch and in what way. That has to do with, you know, land use, elevation, soil types, all of the cover, all of that sort of thing. Basically, anything that's been manipulated or converted from a pre-settlement condition to something that is now more productive. Theoretically, there's more watershed from those areas, there's sediment delivered from those areas, and it becomes an engineering question as to how does that ultimately impact the drainage system downstream. And then there's the idea of hydrologic burden, which is if even though I might not need the ditch for my drainage, and we're gonna look at a case that talked about this. I might be sending a burden downstream that if the ditch wasn't there, I'd be flooding my neighbors out. And so by removing that burden, that's a benefit as well. And this is a case, from, well, again, 20-some years ago, Art and Dwayne Knoll, they were on the Swift Stevens Polk County joint ditch. They were 2 miles away from the ditch and a couple 100 feet above the ditch. And their argument was, we're high and dry. Our water would flow downhill. That's just a matter of engineering, reality. And so we don't need the ditch. And the viewers in that case looked at it and said, but wait a minute, Art and Dwayne, you have been installing tile, you've been installing surface ditches, you've been connecting all of those to road ditch networks that ultimately use this ditch as an outlet for drainage. And we think you're benefited by that. And again, the benefit wasn't huge because the viewers recognized that they were up high and further away from the ditch. And so they applied certain deductions and reductions to their benefits. But the court came back, and if you look at the last sentence of the paragraph there, without the ditch, the water would have accumulated on the downstream landowners, but that now carries that burden away, and that's a benefit to these folks. So that's another basis of benefit, and it's just the way that these things have evolved over time. Then, what the viewers really do is, once they understand the nature of the hydrologic benefit or burden placed on a ditch, they try to divvy up the land and treat similar acres in a similar way, and Brian will go into that in detail, and come up with an economic value of that benefit. And so it could be the increase in the market value of the land because it can now be more productive because it's able to be drained. Imagine something that maybe before the ditch was built was a cattail slough, and then after the ditch was built, it became wet meadow. There's definitely a difference in value between cattail slough and wet meadow, or if it was really good, it was a cattail slough and then it got drained and now it's row crop. Definitely a difference in value between that pre-condition and the after ditch condition. That's one of the ways. Could be increased yields, increased productivity, or a conversion to a potentially new use. There's a lot of areas, not around here so much, but in other areas of the state where huge areas are now industrial parks. But they used to be farmland that was benefited. And the whole reason why the industrial park could get developed is because you have this ditch system as an outlet for drainage. So that land continues to see this benefit going up based on what the ditch does or provides, or the burden that they're able to put on the ditch. And then there's this idea about so there's that increase in value, and then there's the cost of the burden. If I'm sending water to the ditch, even though I might not immediately need the ditch as an outlet for drainage, and that creates an additional maintenance cost because I'm putting sediment in the ditch, or I'm taking up channel capacity, or I'm causing the channel to be full longer, and that's creating instability in the side slopes and they're caving in. That's an economic burden that I'm placing on the ditch that I should have some responsibility to pay for. So that's the other aspect of the economics, is the burden. And again, Brian will talk a little bit about how they go about evaluating that. Then in this part of the state especially, we have this idea of protection benefit, which is really, if you think about it, if all the water in the Red River Valley wants to head up to the northwest, and I put a perfectly east-west ditch in it, I'm able to drain from the south to that ditch, and then the ditch carries my water away. And then what used to manifest itself as a sheet flow, basically flowing northwest across my neighbors, is now intercepted by that ditch. And so my neighbors to the north side of the ditch are protected. And Brian will talk a little bit about that. And, since 1948, at least, the Attorney General has recognized that as a basis of benefits. There have been some other cases around the state that have confirmed that that can be a basis. The protection of the land from being overflowed because a ditch intercepts the water that would otherwise flow on top of that land can be considered a benefit as well. Then we have the concept of outlet benefits. So this is important when you have ditch A that flows into ditch B. If ditch A flows into ditch B, ditch A requires ditch B as its outlet and consumes a certain amount of the capacity of ditch B and creates a certain amount of cost on ditch B. And so the drainage code recognizes that for an outletting ditch, there's a benefit assigned there, and the viewers are instructed to look and say, you can either assign that outlet benefit on each individual parcel in ditch A, you can assign it to ditch A as a whole, and then those would in turn be distributed according to the benefits rule for ditch A. or you can, just do on a watershed acre basis, just kind of a flat charge. Most viewers pick that item too. They'll look and Brian will explain the process that his team uses. Other teams use different processes. They're all, I think, valid and defensible. But mostly they'll say, because of the amount of ditch B that ditch A uses, we're gonna assign a benefit of X% of the total benefits on ditch A, and then that gets assigned out. State land is also determined, can also be benefited, so a land owned by the DNR, but there's a special consideration, and there's a special portion of the drainage code that requires the viewers to look at what is the purpose for which it's being managed, and what is the benefit that's attributable to that. So you can imagine the state might have a big parcel of land that's got a large wetland complex that they want to manage and drain out every few years to try to manage vegetation or for wildlife purposes or for some other habitat purpose. And when they drain it, they got to use the ditch as an outlet for that lake management or that wetland management for that water management purpose. Well, if the ditch had never been built, they wouldn't be able to do that. It's a benefit to the state, and the viewers can look at that as an example. If you have a different area that the state owns that they just manage as natural land and it's in that pre-settlement condition, meaning it doesn't deliver any more burden to the downstream system than Mother Nature intended, that's probably not benefit. If you have another area that's trying to be managed for upland bird hunting and it has to be drained in order to do that, that might be benefited. So the viewers look at all of that, including the state lands, including public highways, railroads, all of those things that utilize the drainage system as an outlet for drainage. And then how are the benefits used? When the benefits are determined, they all go into a big long list. By landowner, by parcel, and then there's a total. And so each individual land is assigned a certain amount of benefit. And again, Brian will go through that in detail in terms of how his team does that. But what we end up with is we end up with a big roster that says, John has 5% obligation on this ditch. April has 10% obligation on the ditch. So for every $100 that gets spent, I pay $5, she pays $10. The reality is that usually it's a fraction of a percent. And so, but that still makes a difference. And Brian will talk about how that roster gets managed and listed out. We are also obligated to look at potential damages that are associated with the drainage system that have not been paid. This day and age, it's mostly about grass buffer area. But it can also be, if you've got area next to a drainage system that's in some program and we disturb it, that could be a damage. We gotta pay to restore that. It could also be, like I said, if we're gonna do some work where we're gonna flatten those side slopes and we have to acquire additional area for that purpose, then a damage gets paid on that. But Brian will go into some of the unique issues related to the grass buffers and how they determine those damages. I want to cover one more thing and then get a little bit differently into how we manage those funds. There is an alternative to doing redeterminations of benefits, but it only applies to a repair. So the legislature adopted this provision in the drainage code and renewed it this year for another 5 years that says, I don't have to do a benefits determination. I can simply charge everyone within the entire watershed of the ditch based on what their runoff coefficient is in relation to everybody else. And it's an engineering process basically where the engineers go and they look at the drainage area. They look at soils, slopes, cover types, all of those sorts of things, and they assign then a runoff value per some designated portion of land. And they tally all those up. And so I might have, again, I might have a runoff coefficient that's 5% of the total, which means if we spend $100, I'm paying $5. It's just a little bit different way to do this, but it only applies to repairs. And it's a one and done. It can't be reused. So every time you spend money, if you're going to do this, you'd have to do this process over again, which I think can be expensive. This process is great if you're going to reconstruct a ditch. You have to basically start and redo the whole thing from bottom to top. It's not so good if all you're doing is spot repairs because it's just too expensive to manage on that basis. And that's where a redetermination of benefits and a benefits rule is much more realistic. The reason why we want good updated benefits rule is that every ditch system is supposed to pay for itself. So every item of cost on the drainage system, inspections, the administrative processes, any construction that occurs, any routine maintenance, that all has to be paid for, and it has to come from an account that's established for the drainage system. And that account takes in all the money that's derived from assessment, any external funds that might become available for work on the drainage system, and it gets debited with every item of expense. And then, again, it's not supposed to be subsidized by any outside fund. We have 2 grass buffer obligations in Minnesota. One is related to the drainage code. So this has been in the drainage code since the 1970s, that any time we will engage viewers to determination of any kind, whether that's for the establishment of a new ditch, improvement of an existing ditch, or a redetermination of benefits, if grass buffer area has not been acquired and established, the viewers are obligated to determine a damage value. Now, that's the viewer's obligation. The drainage authority can modify that, adjust it, change it in some way. And this is important because as of 2018, there's another law that requires the same buffer, 16.5 feet adjacent to the open channel of the ditch, as a landowner obligation at the landowner's expense without compensation. And so the advantage that the drainage code has is that it requires and provides or allows for compensation. And then secondly, those grass buffers become part of the drainage system that it should be inspected and potentially maintained. The reality is most landowners maintain that on their own because it's way easier than rather than waiting for the drainage authority to show up to spray the thistles. You're going to be out there taking care of it anyway. So you're going to spray your thistles. But technically, once the grass buffer is established, it's supposed to be maintained, and the cost of maintaining it is part of the ditch system expense. That's important because the majority of ditches that we're going to talk about today have never had the grass buffer area acquired, and nobody's received compensation for it. And it has been the practice, at least of the Sand Hill River Watershed District Board, to pay those damages out. Kind of maybe make it better than what the legislature did in 2018 related to those systems. Any questions of me? Sir.
I got kind of a strange analogy. That's the watershed board, not in Soria being late. But the infinite number of scenarios that you've seen or described, they were all lines, their own line coming down. And we have maze and shell. And every reality finally at one point has to deal with the law.
Mm-hmm.
So if it comes to a law that says shall, okay, it's gonna drop below the line, then it's coming to the watershed.
Yep.
If it's a may, let's pretend it goes sideways. How many times as a watershed board can we get through that line and get some bays?
Oh,
There's, you know,
well, you talk about a may allowing you to go sideways. You ever been sideways on the highway? I mean, how's that turn out for you?
it's not good, it's just stagnant for a while.
Yeah, my experience, again, 26 years of doing this, and no matter where I go in the state, there's always that ditch that everybody's just ignored for decades, right? And what the mays end up doing is they come back to bite you in the hind end. Because every time you defer something because it's not mandatory, it's not required, it's a discretionary thing, you may do it, but you're not required to. When it comes time when you no longer can ignore it, it's probably 2 or 3 times more expensive than if you just addressed it on that up front. So I'm gonna tell you, even though the drainage code might say you may do this, I'm gonna say if you believe that the benefits area, the benefit distribution is out of whack, I can't tell you have to, but you should fix it. Because what that means is the wrong people are paying and others are benefiting because of other people are benefiting without paying their freight. So ignoring or just deferring because you can usually comes back to bite you. It's kind of like going sideways on the highway.
So my opinion of this annual ditch. Look, I got my fellow board members looking at me now, it's a.
It's one voice, it's only one
We've been
man.
going sideways on the Sand Hill ditch, on Maze. And now we're on a 6-lane highway going about 80. On Maze sideways, and we really need, I think, to have to do something.
But again, part of that is what's in the best interest of the system, what's consistent with what the statute allows or requires. Brian's gonna talk about some options, and one of the options is always do nothing. Well, you can always do nothing. The question is that the best? Well, sometimes it is the best choice. But even if you do nothing, there's still gonna be expenses, people are still gonna be assessed, and then you ask the question, are the right people being assessed? We had a question come up in the last session about if the Sand Hill River Watershed District decides to do a redetermination on benefits for the Sand Hill ditch, does that automatically trigger that all the other ditches around it have to be redetermined? The short answer is no, they don't have to be. But if the viewers are gonna be out looking at that watershed area and there are other ditches there too, it might make sense to do that just because you're paying once for something rather than paying twice for looking at the same ground. So again, it's just a consideration. That's mostly a consideration for the Polk County Board of Commissioners because they're the ones that are responsible for those ditches that are up in the upper part of the watershed that ultimately flows to the Sand Hill ditch. Any other questions? Sir.
As a board member, what's the 80-mile-an-hour issue coming down the road? So I'm not familiar.
Well, we got erosion and, Brian will explain a little more in April and Zach later on. And maybe I should have held my comment. But you can listen to a lot of this and you don't get too excited about it. But I thought maybe I'd throw a small firecracker out there to start things off, but it is important and it's a huge, well, I'm sure these guys feel the same way. It's a struggle thinking about what to do as board members. It's a lot of money and it's not our money, it's your money.
I can give a bit of an example too. I think for the last however long anyone can remember, the Sand Hill River Watershed District has been assigning or budgeting about $15,000 a year just to routine maintenance on the Sand Hill ditch. Is that about right?
Until the last 2 years.
Right. So you can imagine if they were doing $15,000 back in 1972, what do you think that's actually worth in terms of how much dirt you're turning in 2024? It's significantly less. And so the reality is it's just the cost of routine maintenance is going up. And even if there are no plans to do any major reconstruction. And April will show you in a third presentation, so you just buckle in, you're gonna be here for just a little bit. That this district has brought in millions of dollars to rehabilitate and work on the Sand Hill ditch in order to make it efficient, make it stable, try to reduce those overall costs. And almost none of that has been assessed to landowners. It's all been external funding. So to date, the watershed district has done a great job of finding these external funds, whether they be federal, state, or otherwise. If that doesn't last, if that's not a sustainable model, if that money doesn't continue, then they're gonna end up having to look to landowners to generate those funds. And if we're gonna have to look to landowners to generate those funds, then we wanna make sure it's the right landowners paying me the right amount, and that's part of this process. So, if there's no other questions, we're gonna take a quick break for, let's see, it's about 13 minutes to 2. Let's take just 3 minutes to stretch your legs if you have to use the bathroom. We're gonna have a short video and then Brian's gonna give a presentation. Set you up for success, brother.
Yeah, I think I got it all set up. I think it should be good to go. Yep. Shortcut that little.
This guy?
Yep.
Slide dance, right? Gonna reach up here for a glass of water or something. Get rid of it.
Just start the whole thing off.
There you go. Quit reaching around. You gotta shut up. I like the way you asked it. It's really easy.
Really, very few maze.
And eventually it's gonna come back. And it's gonna be something.
For 60 years, so.
Yeah, and,
68.
and we can.
Even I know 68-year-olds that are gonna, getting some meters replaced.
That's exactly.
I'm stagnant, you want to start.
Yeah, exactly. I got to meet,
Is your right knee replaced?
This, pretty bad.
When you sit down, you can tell you that.
So it's we actually need to go all over. I was farming sugar.
Yeah.
Just kind of.
I can read that, obviously. For the most part, I don't need to write my
But I told her, I'm like, well, if I get appointed, I'll be fine.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing.
So. About once a month.
There's no.
Like this.
Yeah.
That would have been the year we had.
Looks pretty good. Next year, it's a lot better. You'll see in the video, they'll show some of the schematics and stuff.
Oh, no, but, I remember back then.
Yeah, you know, so I think, 56, well, I think it went in the go in the 20s. Well, my dad said it went up in the 20s, but this configuration, they tried to replace that. The dad had said that railroad needs something.
Okay, I think we'll get going here. Hopefully this is loud enough. We'll give it a shot. If it's not, we'll get April to crank it up a little bit, but this was just a video we put together where it kind of emphasizes how drainage in Minnesota was really not driven by necessarily farmers just saying, I just want to increase my yield. It's actually, that was the goal, but it was driven by population increase. So we just kind of put this together.
Farming Evolution is a story about how, as the population increases, the need for carrying capacities must also increase. And along with this, so has the burden placed on our drainage systems. The story begins in the mid-1800s when early European settlers began farming in the Midwest. The work is grueling, and it is not uncommon for the average farmer to walk behind a horse-drawn plow for 40 miles in a single day. Natural wetlands are initially seen as obstacles to agriculture. Initially, only lands with good natural drainage are cleared for agricultural purposes. Then a major shift happens. With advancements created by the Industrial Revolution for the first time in our country's history, more of our population now live in the cities, driven there by the hopes of better paying jobs in factories. The population in the city is now reliant upon rural farmers for their daily food. As the burden increases on farmers, so does the burden of carrying capacity on each and every acre of land. Farmers start using open ditches to drain waterlogged soils and improve crop yields. By the 1890s, Minnesota's first drainage laws are created, promoting drainage projects to reclaim wetland acres for agricultural use. With this, we see the adaptation of subsurface tile drainage begin, using clay tiles to manage water levels more effectively. By 1905, the establishment of the Minnesota Drainage Commission is created to oversee and regulate drainage activities. Through the 1920s, large-scale drainage projects expand with state and federal support, transforming vast wetland acres into productive farmland. In the 1930s, the Great Depression slows drainage activity, but federal New Deal programs provide funding for some projects. In the 1940s, a post-World War II agricultural boom leads to renewed interest in drainage, with approved technology in farm equipment. The 50s and 70s provide many technological advancements, including more efficient excavating equipment, accelerating drainage installation. The 1960s and 1970s bring with it growing environmental awareness and begin to highlight the ecological impacts of drainage on wetlands and wildlife. By 1972, the Clean Water Act is passed, leading to increased regulation of water resources, including agricultural drainage. In the 1980s, a shift towards balancing agricultural productivity with environmental conservation programs promoting wetland restoration and conservation practices are introduced. The 1990s bring with it more precision agriculture and modern drainage techniques such as laser-controlled drainage equipment, which has advanced even further in the early 2000s with the development of GPS-controlled equipment. These modern controlled pieces of equipment are a common tool on every American farm. The use of drainage equipment as a yield advantage has never become more apparent than through the visual representation of crop and yield loss in real-time yield monitors, now a common facet in every piece of harvest equipment used in the agricultural setting today. As the evolution of farming and drainage practices evolve, they have collided with an aging public drainage system infrastructure. Our public drainage system infrastructure has reached the age of a 75 to 125-year-old, and though they have done so with little to no maintenance, they have lived double their original life expectancy. private improvements to agricultural acres have continued to increase, placing a greater burden on the public drainage systems. These conditions find farmers caught once again in a widespread drainage initiative. Except this time, it is not to create drainage systems, but to repair public drainage system infrastructure back to its as constructed condition or improved to meet modern-day drainage standards. The redetermination of benefits process is step one of getting drainage systems back on track, as no work can be done until the "who pays for this and how" question is answered. The capacity of our Earth to provide space, to produce food, and to create energy are all limited. Humans thrive on only about 17% of the Earth's surface, while only 4% is suitable for growing food. We depend on these limited resources for our survival, yet our population increases as if they are infinite. As an ever-growing population must rely on the 1% of the population known as farmers, how will future generations manage increasing demand for carrying capacities of every acre while managing environmental concerns?
Okay, so again, I'm Brian Murphy. I'm with H2 Overviewers. I'm actually the president of the company. I visited with the Sandhill board on several different occasions talking about the viewing process. But really what it boils down to is my job is to determine if a dollar is spent on any drainage system or public drainage system, who pays for that dollar and how. So John gave the analogy of if he was 5%, he was responsible for $5 of every 100 in April would be responsible for 10. That's ultimately really all it boils down to that we're trying to do. There is a lot of facets that go into this to determine that amount and to look at the different ways that a drainage system is used or the lands are utilizing that drainage system. So one of the things that we talked about the last meeting is there's really only 3 requirements to be a viewer in the state of Minnesota. You need to be a Minnesota resident, you need to have a pulse, and you need to be disinterested. You're not allowed to own any property along the drainage system or be a benefited landowner yourself or be damaged by the system. Obviously, they're looking for people who have a little bit more experience or a background in drainage that are going to be able to do this, either environmental background, drainage background, those types of things. And for myself, like I said, I'm the president of the company, but I was a 12-year multi-state drainage contractor. I used to do drainage work in this area in Polk and Marshall County. I'm originally from Warren. I kind of grew up in this area. I've taught different community classes on LiDAR implementation and practical uses. The other people that work for the team or in the team is Aaron Goldman. He's a former drainage inspector for Sibley County. He's got a master's degree in geology. He's also a captain in the U.S. Army National Guard. Then we've got Scott Henderson. Oh, he's a former administrator at a watershed district in kind of central Minnesota. He's got a master's degree in environmental health and science from the University of Minnesota. He's got 25 years of experience managing different public drainage systems within that watershed that he worked for. Then we have Derek Ebertelski. He's been with the company since it started. He's involved in every single project we have ever done. He's always been involved in customer service. And like I said before, if you guys are a landowner on the system and we get hired to do this, likely at some point you will be talking to Derek, as will the staff and the board members. The other guys we have working for us that help out with not only GIS capabilities, but a lot of the field viewing is Ken DeGeer. He was born and raised on a family farm, still farms today. And he was a colonel, retired colonel in the U.S. Army Reserves. And then the last guy on the team, we pulled him out of retirement. It's my dad, Larry Murphy. He was the Marshall and Polk Rural Water System Manager out of Warren, Minnesota. For 30 plus years, he managed that water system. But he's got a background in soil and water and has been working for the company since it started. So, when I was asked to talk about this project and talk about the viewing and the things that go into this, it was really really obvious when we start to look at the size of the system and all the comments that John made earlier, talking about the laws, that there's a pretty big inequity here on this system. So what you're seeing here in all this colored area, the green, not the yellow, but the green and all these other colored areas is actually, that's the watershed for the Sandhill ditch system. Sandhill ditch system is right here. The Sandhill River goes back this way, but the ditch system that's legally established is just right there. And currently, there's about 40,000 acres in this red box that are paying for any repairs and maintenance to date. But all of these acres are using this system as an outlet. Now, this isn't by fault of the viewers who did the redetermination in the 1950s, because as John mentioned, in the 1950s, the law was for them just to look at the low wet acres or possible people who were being protected by it. But a lot of things changed. You know, it was brought up that there's this word may or this word shall. And that is one of the big changes. So prior to the 1980s, prior to 1986, Minnesota statute 103E315 subdivision 6 said viewers may determine benefits to lands that cause the need for system capacity or increased maintenance. And in 1986, legislators changed that word from may to shall. So it's no longer our choice anymore. If there's a lot of things that maybe don't have to do, but one of them is follow the law when we're going through this process. And when it says we shall determine benefits to any lands that impact the need for system capacity or system maintenance, that may include all of these lands. For us, what we will be doing is we'll be relying heavily on the engineer to say, where does the hydrologic burden come from? And I know we were talking early on with the Sandhill board, and there was a board member who lived somewhere over in this area and one who lived in here. And the board member over here said, we got that 3-4 inch rain. It was localized just to this area. When did you see that here? He said it was about 3 to 4 days later. So that's what we're talking about, is when, you know, there was water spilling onto the banks, impacting this area and burdening the system. So when they get a rain now in this area, there's nowhere for it to go. And that burden comes from here. We have a little bit better illustrations coming up to kind of show that and reaffirm that. But that's the inequity we've got to look for as we're going through that. So this is kind of the driver for most of this conversation, is the sheer size of this 250,000 acres and about 40,000 acres currently paying.
Where is fertile like on that?
Good point. There's a little button right.
Yeah, so fertile would be out right in this area right here.
Thanks. These red areas, by the way, are what John was referring to when he said there's these potential non-contributing basins out there. And these are areas that drain into a low, like hole, lake, pond, that doesn't really have an outlet where it's gonna get to a certain point that it's gonna flow into the ditch system itself. So there will be, within this boundary, there will be acres that will be considered non-benefited, even though they've been altered from their pre-settlement condition. So John talked a lot about that too. He said that, you know, we need to look at the lands and we need to look at the impact that lands have on the drainage system. And a lot of what he talked about was if the lands were increasing their drainage capacity. So if they were doing more surface drainage or subsurface drainage, but that's actually not what the law says. The law goes deeper than that and says that if you change it from a pre-settlement condition, and that could be just simply you plow that field, you work that field, you have altered that and you changed the way the water naturally flowed off of that land in a pre-settlement condition, thus possibly increasing the burden on downstream, on the downstream system. So I'll talk a little bit more about that, what that means and how we're going to go through that. But, you know, reasons for redetermination, John talked about this, but it's, you know, it's 705. It's the drainage authority shall inspect and maintain the efficiency of the drainage system. And in an effort to maintain the efficiency of the drainage system, they must also make sure the correct people are paying for it. So the original benefits no longer reflect current market values. That's got to be the case. It was 68 years ago that these were redetermined. The possible total benefits of the system might right now today sit at about 20,000. And when we get done doing the redetermination of benefits, it could be in the millions. And what that does is it restricts, because they say that you have to show economic value before you can do any project. So if there's $15,000 worth of benefits, I think a lot of you guys know, especially if you're farmers in the room, you clean a mile of ditch, and it does not take very long to eat through $10,000 worth of money. So what this is doing is it's increasing that board of the economic value so that it gives them the ability to do more and bigger projects while they're working on that, instead of spreading it over so many years. Not saying that that's what they're going to do and that they're going to do a huge project, but then the economic value is there to display that.
Brian, what is the law? What does it say? You're only allowed to do if you got the ditches, the value is 20,000, you can spend like 20,000 a year?
About that, this gives me an opportunity to get the green light answer, which is it depends.
Okay.
Yeah, there are provisions in the code that says that the cost of what you're doing has to be less than the total benefits. For maintenance, other than something that has a specific petition threshold to the maintenance, you can spend whatever it takes to put the system back into its originally constructed hydraulic capacity. Is that the best thing to do, though? That's the big question. There is also a limitation on if you're going to create a standing repair fund or maintenance fund, you can only have that fund sit at about 20% of the total benefits. So if you have an ancient ditch that was established back in 1910 and has total benefits of $2,000, you're not gonna have much of a maintenance fund, even though you can spend all kinds of money to maintain the system. So there are some practical issues related to that. But suffice it to say that because it's a mandatory obligation to maintain, you can actually exceed that total benefits in maintenance. But if your benefits role is not equitable, you're creating a bigger problem by assessing it density.
Thanks, John. Good question. Thank you. This is probably the number one reason why we're here today talking about this, is there are lands that are utilizing the system that were not originally included in the benefit area. That is one of the reasons that a drainage authority may order a redetermination of benefits. And correct me if I'm wrong, John, but I think, someone that was in that red area who's currently paying, they could also petition for a redetermination of benefits. And then it would be out of the board's hand. They would have to move forward with the redetermination of benefits. Another reason is division. So sometimes systems get divided into two systems. What we see more often than not is 2 or 3 systems get consolidated into one. That's another reason why a redetermination of benefits may take place. And then remove lands that are no longer benefited. This doesn't happen very often, but generally the case is if it's a landowner, he's a quarter of a mile from the ditch, but he just does not get along with that landowner and he goes a different direction and tiles and drains his water into a different direction than into the current one. Might be a reason why we would remove someone from the benefited area. So until recently, nearly all redetermination of benefits were done by, we used the term at the last one, the 3 old guys in the pickup truck, right? Whoever had the most beer, they got to. So they would drive around, they would look at the land, they would kind of kick the soil and decide which lands are draining towards that and what the benefits should be. We're very fortunate that we have a lot of different tools available to us to use. Probably the biggest one we use is LiDAR. I'm guessing, a lot of guys in here, probably growers in the area, they're probably very experienced with LiDAR, but it's just an acronym for light detection and ranging. That's where light is used in a similar fashion as radar uses sound. So what happens is a plane flies at a known elevation, it shoots a broad spectrum beam of light down at the Earth's surface. The way that that's bounced back tells them not only what type of surface, whether it's vegetative, hard surface, what type of surface they're encountering, but what the elevation of that surface is. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about this because it is such a big thing we use in the process. But LiDAR is used in many different industries, from forestry to military to state lands to engineers to bridge builders, city planners. I give the example that I could set up a LiDAR speed gun in the middle of this room. I could map out everything in this room. The rafters, the doors, windows if there were any, and right down to the plugins in the wall and what screw holds that plug-in plate to the wall. It's very detailed. It's used most commonly right now in autonomous vehicles. But this vehicle here's got LiDAR speed guns placed all over it, and it allows the vehicle to see in all directions all the time. If you imagine this guy in the red hat, is a LiDAR speed gun. He can interact with anything within his visual arena. He does so at not hundreds of times a second or thousands of times a second, but hundreds of thousands of times a second. He's interacting with everything in his visual arena, from buildings to other cars, pedestrians, dogs, street signs, potholes, whatever it is. Can actually start to anticipate turns of cars by subtle movements they make with their hand on the steering wheel before they even execute that turn. So a great way to interact with things in your visual arena, but it's also capable of seeing things you can't see with the human eye. And I'm going to pick on these three elements, carbon and sulfur dioxide and methane, because they're what make up largely high density pockets of pollution. So city planners can use maps like this to determine if we construct a real tall building here, what will that do to airflow? If we time out traffic lights like this, what will idle time do to pockets of pollution? Again, has the ability to see particles smaller than dust, and we're using it for something really simple, which is just to see the Earth's elevation. And with that, we get this, which probably some of you have seen and are familiar with, but it's just a topography map. The purple on the far left is the high ground, the red on the far right is the low ground. And between those two color variations is 255 different elevation breaks represented by 255 different spectrums of color, showing how land is flowing. And you can see, this is some kind of a major system or artery here that's got little tributaries flowing into it. So it's, again, it's just a really nice tool for us to look at to get that, those boundaries established when we're looking at a drainage system. So we do that on our computer, but then we have to go out in the field. We have to verify that what we're seeing on our computer is really taking place in the real world, because it's not always things it can't see, such as culverts underneath roads, doesn't know that they're there, just sees the road as a dam. So we send guys out in the field to look at where the ditch is located, to determine where culverts are. Specific culverts might impact a drainage boundary. So we go out with a data collector, which is just a tablet that's kind of showing us where we are in the world, and we can make notes of, where a culvert is. Like this area right here was not originally included in this boundary that we were working on until we noticed the culvert's location right here, allowing conveyance of water through that road, underneath that road, and into the watershed. So you can see this blue line kind of coming on and off. That's where we thought the watershed boundary is, and then we knew to remove that once we discovered that culvert. So again, it's just a lot of great technology out there, but you do have to spend the time in the field verifying that all these things you see on the computer are really there. So we have a classification process that we use. It was defined over 8 years ago. We got input from landowners, we got input from boards, both watersheds and county boards, legal experts, engineers, data processing specialists, in our own company experience. But we follow a process that requires you to follow specific steps to ensure a high quality, fair, and equitable result. The team that I introduced you to here has done over 3 million acres in the state of Minnesota on redetermination of benefits in 30 different counties. So the classification process looks like this. When we're looking at a drainage system, we have lots of different land uses that we look at. We're going to look at residential property, roads, different things like that, but we're also going to look at agriculture. And when we're looking at agriculture specifically, we're kind of breaking that up into multi-classifications from most benefited to least benefited. And it starts by looking at the aerial. We want to know, where does the ditch exist? So we pull in the aerial, we lay the ditch onto that aerial imagery, and then we look at what little tributaries flow into that ditch. Because basically this is just going to show us the boundary, or the watershed, if you will. Very similar to the Sandhill Watershed District has a boundary to its jurisdiction, and it's based on a similar type of criteria. So once we do that, we know now the acres that we're going to start zeroing in on and looking at. Now we're going to start laying all these different layers on top of it and driving these classifications. So we start by looking at something simple like contour maps. Contour maps show us slopes. So it shows us steep areas, it shows us flat areas that are in need of drainage, but you can start to see the classification take hold and start to begin to be developed here. Then we're going to look at elevation. Elevation in general, but elevation relativity to the ditch bottom. And then when that's applied, it's going to shift and drive those classifications yet again. So just to give you an idea here, red is the most benefited. Blue is the least benefited. That's kind of how this one works. It's a very small system in southern Minnesota that we've done. This is obviously not the Sandhill ditch system. Then we're gonna look at soils. The soils also tell us what types of acres need drainage. So is it clay soil, sandy soil, hydrophytic soil? What type of soil exists within that watershed boundary? Definitely matters for our evaluation. And yet again, you see the classification kind of shift and take shape again. Then we're gonna start to look at what the distance is you are from the ditch with these different classifications. So we visit the first and highest, most classification, which is the red acres. And those, John kind of talked about those. Those were maybe wet cattails that turned into wet meadows, or even in great circumstances, turned into possible rope run. Those are the highest benefited lands. They were flooded prior to the establishment of the drainage system. Then we have the yellow acres, which also exist close to the drainage system. Generally, they were likely farmed prior to the establishment of the drainage system, but it was not without substantial risk to that grower. They may have lost crops there 2 out of 10 years, and now that the ditch is established, they're losing crops less often. It's low, flat soils, benefiting from drainage close in proximity to the ditch system. Then we start to look at the green acres, or class 3. And those are the ones that oftentimes are kind of the hillside, if you will. They're moving a little bit further away from the ditch system, but they consist of soils and slopes that definitely benefit from drainage. And then lastly, we look at the blue acres, and this is pretty important, I think, for the Sandhill system, because I think by and large, most of the drainage system is going to consist of these blue acres. They are the least benefited acres. They were definitely farmed prior to the establishment of the ditch system. They were the hilltops. Their water ran off of that property, whether that ditch was there or not. But they created that need for system capacity and system maintenance. So I'll give the example of if the Sandhill ditch was built in 1956, and they didn't just look at those 40,000 acres that are benefited when they built that. They looked at that there's 250,000 acres that drain through this. So they didn't build it like this. They built it like this. And that additional capacity came at a cost. That construction to make it bigger costs more, and to maintain it costs more. And it's not just a cost or a burden placed on those immediately benefited landowners in the 40,000. It's a cost that, or a burden that's placed on that drainage system by all the acres that send water downstream. So this is just an example of about 3 or 4 of the different GIS layers. We use 70 plus different GIS layers that drive these classifications. They're all stacked in what we refer to as the GIS data sandwich. Each one has a different algorithm tied to it. Each one's weighted a little bit different, and that's what derives these classifications. So beyond that, we also look at each sub watershed. So here's an example of a drainage system that we classified into the 4 main classifications for agriculture. But what we didn't still know was what was the ability each acre had to utilize that drainage system. So what I'm saying is if the ditch is here, but your red acre is down here, you can't drain that unless you're willing to lift it and pump it in, or figure out some other way to do it, or petition for an improvement and get the ditch system lower. But there could be a red acre in another place about a half a mile away that sits at this elevation, and it was able to gravity flow tile into it. So what we kind of had to do was look at all of the sub watersheds within a drainage system. So it's basically like a redetermination on each sub watershed. This one kind of illustrates that the green ones had pretty good drainage, and the brown or rusty colored ones were a little too low to get good drainage. So in order to do this, what we first had to do was establish what's optimal. And we did that through a process called the grading criteria. So we looked at, if you had tile on your farm, you wanted to put tile in it. First consideration you're going to give is, what kind of cover can I get on that pipe? Pipe manufacturers recommend at least 2 feet of cover over the top of that pipe, so you're not crushing it with equipment or hooking it with tillage equipment. So that was criteria number 1. What's the depth of the pipe that we can get on this farm? Then we want to look at what kind of slope can we get on that pipe? Is it going to be flat, or is it going to have a little bit of a steep run on it to really flow water? And then where does it come in? Where's the outlet in the ditch system? Well, nobody wants to be below the bottom. Everyone wants to be a little bit above the bottom of the ditch when they're pouring water. So if you're above the bottom, you've got good slope, you've got good cover, optimum drainage. Anytime you don't have good cover, you don't have good slope, where you came in at the bottom of the ditch, we're gonna say that's less optimal. And what we do is we just reduce the benefit we applied to all of those different classifications in any one of those sub watersheds that don't have that ability. So it's just a way to make sure that we're looking at each individual acre and what ability it has. Benefits are based on ability. We talk about how a drainage system might offer a land, let's say that, I know that these are fictitious numbers, but let's say that piece of property is worth $1,000 an acre. And then it has good drainage because the drainage system was established near it, and now it's worth $3,000. You could say, well, that's a $2,000 benefit. But actually what we do is we take it a step further and say, but you might have to spend $1,000 of your own money for private improvement costs, surface ditches, subsurface ditches, et cetera, to realize that full potential. So instead of saying you have $2,000 worth of benefits, we're going to say your net benefit is $1,000. Whether if you tile or not tile or do surface drain or don't surface drain, that's entirely up to you. It's what ability does your acre have is what we're looking at when we're setting forth those benefits. So just a process embedded in the process that yields that result. So now specifically the Sandhill watershed ditch. Sorry, I talk fast and loud, so interrupt me if you need to. But the Sandhill ditch system is large. And you can just tell by this aerial imagery, this, like I said, a 250,000 acre drainage system. But what we're really looking at here is who's really benefited and how. So what we reached out to Zach and we're asking Zach, the engineer for the Sandhill watershed district, where does the burden come from? Because there's benefits in different ways. John talked about direct drainage benefits. Those are, you're standing on your property, you can see water flowing off of your property, flowing into the ditch system. That's a direct drainage benefit. No one's going to question that you have that. You're getting blocked from potential flood water by a ditch system intercepting that water. Protection benefit. Nobody's going to argue about that. But it's these indirect drainage benefits where your land value didn't go up because that ditch exists, but you're creating an economic burden downstream that gets the ultimate outlet is the Sandhill ditch carrying it to the river. And by statute, those lands are also benefited. So it looks a little bit like this, where we look at these tributaries, these natural water courses way out on the eastern edge of the system, and how they come together, gather and collect, and just keep intensifying and building until they hit the floodplain, and it just flows out on sheet flow. Now, prior to the establishment of the Sandhill ditch, the water actually took a course from here, kind of flowed a little bit northwest, and then came back down to the southwest and ultimately into the river. That was the natural water course of Sandhill River at the time. It's just so flat there, it rarely stayed the banks. It just spilled everywhere. So in the 50s, when the Army Corps of Engineers did this for protection or floodwater prevention, what they did was they channelized the water and made it go straight, and they reduced that flood area by having that ditch system contain that water within it. Does it contain it within it under every flood event, every rain event? Absolutely not. But under normal conditions, the water is contained within that system and it's not spilling out across those acres. So then we need to establish where is the watershed for the Sandhill ditch system. So again, there's still going to be flood protection benefits outside of the watershed up in this area. But what we really want to know is what's the actual boundary or drainage boundary of the Sandhill ditch. And then this is where you can kind of see what I'm talking about when I say direct drainage benefits versus indirect. So close to the ditch system. Protection from flood, direct drainage benefit, more dollars per acre of benefit flowing into that ditch system. You get a little bit further upstream, still close to the drainage system, still impacting that capacity, still pretty good dollar per acre benefit. But then you get a little bit further away, and it's maybe a little bit less because it's impacting that capacity and that need for maintenance less. And then you get even further away, and maybe those dollars start to change to more cents. And then you get even further yet away where you're starting to look at maybe some of these outletting systems or just tail in, where it's pennies and maybe even there's some question mark. We need to do some more looking. Is there really a benefit out there? But that's kind of how this process boils out in a nutshell. where we're looking at where is the benefit, where is it derived? Obviously, we have to do the process before we can say each specifically what each parcel is going to pay and what that percentage is. But I just kind of wanted to give you guys an idea of likely how those benefits are going to shake out across this entire watershed. So once we've done that, once we've created these classification maps, we then have to get all this information in what's called a tabular report. And unfortunately, statute, John kind of brought this up, that it's a 40-acre tract. So if you own a half section of 320 acres, you're going to get 8 lines on the report, because we're still required to show every parcel no bigger than 40 at a time. I think it was from back in the day when they didn't have a map, and you owned 320 acres, and they said you had 5 acres that were benefited. You were like, sure, but where are they? At least if they kind of told you what quarter that was, you had an idea. But it looks like this. We break it down by every classification. So we have class 1 are red acres, again, highest value. Class 2 are yellow acres, class 3 are green acres, class 4 are blue. We're also going to look at residential property and see what kind of a benefit they're getting, because obviously they've changed their land from a pre-settlement condition as well. It's accelerating drainage a little bit. It's going to be by and large quite a bit smaller than agriculture acres, because they're not producing homes and growing them there and selling them every year, but they are, having a dry basement. They're able to run their sump pump. They're able to mow and have water shed off of it. In some cases, there will be woodlots that'll be benefited. And then we'll look at the roads, township, county, state roads, what kind of benefit they have as a they're impervious surface. So they shed a lot more water. That water being conveyed away helps protect the toe of the road, helps less maintenance. We're going to look at the ditch footprint itself and the buffer strip. But when we're done, we should have accounted for every acre on this 40-acre parcel down to the 100th of an acre. Then we populate a tabular report with all of those different classifications at the top. And it's really, you just click a button and all of the numbers fall in for every single parcel, every quarter section, for every single one of those 250,000 acres. What this did by automating this was not only allow the viewing process to change from a 3 to 4 year process to less than 12-month process, but it's also a lot more accurate. I'm not in there just typing in all these numbers anymore. I'm a horseshit typer, so I was probably fat figuring a number or transposing a 12 to a 21. But here we've got an overview of a drainage system. We like to send this out to the landowner so that they can see how we apply benefits to their property and to their neighbor's property. Obviously, the map for the Sandhill system is going to be vastly larger than this. But one of the things that it does that provides this GIS deliverable that we're able to give to the county afterwards. So even though this is a watershed ditch, correct me if I'm saying this wrong, but the county still does the assessment side of things, correct?
Yeah.
So for example, if this is an 80-acre parcel right here, right now, with all the viewers' reports that they may or may not have that are older, if this was split into 420s, so let's just say you had an 80-acre parcel and you were going to give 20 acres to your 4 kids, you split it into 420s. With the viewers' reports they have now, the only option they have is to apply 25% of the benefits to each one of these newly created parcels. Well, this one's not even in the watershed. The water doesn't even drain to that ditch system. This one's barely in there, and this one's the highest benefited amount right here. So it's a way for the county to use the information that we've created and they paid for to get and use it long into the future for future parcel splits. That's another reason why sometimes people see these old viewers reports and there's a chunk in the middle that's missing. What used to happen was when people had their farm and their homestead and they farmed that whole quarter section, that was all one parcel. Well, then maybe they decided to sell the farmstead but keep the rest of the land. The farmstead got that parcel ID number and the rest of the quarter section got a new parcel ID number that didn't have any benefits tied to it. And that's another way we get these holes and these benefit holes too that have to be corrected. So delivering this in a way that can be used in the county long-term definitely has some advantages. So now we're going to talk about these. There is 11 Polk County ditch systems and 6 watershed, either ditch systems or projects that drain into the Sandhill ditch system. And when we're calculating benefited landowners, another ditch system is just thought of as another benefited landowner. So if Polk County Ditch 11 dumps into the Sandhill Ditch, they pay a benefit for dumping into the Sandhill Ditch just like any other land. So it's our job to evaluate that and determine what that benefit is. And then when work is done on the Sandhill Ditch, Polk County Ditch 11 gets a bill and they pay whatever percent they are. So we'll use John's analogy. Let's say Polk County Ditch 11 is 5%. They pay $5 on every $100 that's spent. And that's determined through this process that we call calculated contributing systems. I think we landed on that the proper term is outliving systems, not contributing, but so ignore my words on these slides that say that. But the first thing we have to do is look at the whole volume, what's the whole area? And for me, it kind of helps to think of, this is the primary system. So let's just, for sake of conversation, say this is the Sandhill Ditch system, and this is the Polk County system, and this is another Polk County system that uses it as an outlet to get to here. If you think of the main system as a pipe, and you're just gonna add water to it, and every time you add water to it, the pipe has to get bigger and bigger. So right now, this system is designed only to handle the acres in this dark blue area. And as soon as we dump additional buckets into that, it has to get made bigger. So it looks kind of like this. This is the size of the system. It needs to be drain the blue area. We add in this light blue area and you can see how the line has to get bigger. So this is where we're talking about the capacity increase. So a ditch might be made a certain size to handle the acres that are draining into it, but as more are added to it, the ditch system has to be made larger. So likewise with this screen system being added in where it's at, to get to the outlet, the ditch system all the way to the outlet has to be made bigger. So this is where we're talking about, again, that capacity. But the way we calculate this is really just a super simple math equation. I broke it down so it is simple. There's a lot of things that kind of go in behind the scenes. We need to know how many wetland acres are in one system versus another, how many benefited versus non-benefited. What's the runoff curve numbers on acres in one system versus another? But this is the simple math way to show this. Bear with me, this gets a little mathy, but at the end, I promise it's pretty easy. So first thing we got to look at is what's the total watershed acres of all the systems that are using this as an outlet. And for simplicity's sake, we're going to say that's 10,000 acres. Then we need to know how big is each contributing of that 10,000. So we're going to say this light blue system is 2,000 acres or 20%. We're going to say this green system is 4,000 acres or 40%. So now we have the first number in our math equation for both the light blue and the green system. Next thing we need to know is what percent of the total channel is being used. So for this example, we're going to say the total system is 10 miles and the light blue system uses 7 of those 10 miles, so 70%. So what you do is you take 20% times 70% and you get 14% for this light blue system. For the green system, we're going to say it's 80% or 8 miles of the channel being used. So you take 80% times 40% and get 32%. So basically what I'm saying is if $1 is spent here, this light blue system is responsible for 14 cents of that dollar. Likewise, if $1 is spent here, this green system is responsible for 32 cents. Now on the Sandhill Ditch system, if you think of the sheer size of it and the small Polk County systems way out on the end, that number is going to be drastically skewed and be much less, like John indicated. Most landowners and even contributing systems are going to be fractions of percents. But all of that needs to be calculated, and this is the way that it's done. So the next step is, once we've developed all of the classifications, we've looked at and evaluated every parcel, and we're ready to say what this report is going to mean. We're required by law, so the Drainage Authority is required by law to mail you a property owner's report. This is what it looks like. It's just got your name and your address, a little brief description and a bunch of numbers on here that kind of tells you what your benefit's going to be. We didn't really care for that. We didn't think that was a good representation of what you really want to know when a redetermination takes place. So we created what we call a landowner packet. And what it is, it's just a pamphlet that comes to you that says, it's going to say Sandhill Ditch, Sandhill Watershed District. It's going to have your name and address on the back of it. It'll get mailed to you. When you open it up, it'll have the benefits and damages statement. It's another requirement by law for the viewers to put together a benefits and damages statement. And this is just the narrative report of what we've done. This is calling out and talking about everything we did through the process. Explaining what each classification is, et cetera. We have a frequently asked questions page in there too. This really cuts down on a lot of calls that both staff and my staff was getting. I thought it was helpful. And then we send in the system overview. Again, the Sandville ditch system, this is going to be a huge map. Might take several pages to fit it on there. But what I have found through the years is a landowner cares a lot more about how much his neighbor is paying for benefits than he cares about how much his own benefits are. So we always send this overview map so they can see how we applied benefits to everybody. It also includes this tabular report. And you can tell by looking here, this is horrible to read. We publish this on our website. There'll be a link on the watershed website if they move forward with this. For you to go, you can look at what your benefits are. You can look at any neighbor's benefits that you want to. You can compare the two together. Ask questions if you have any. And then we also provide this property owner's report. This time it comes with a map. So we're not just saying in numbers, here's what your benefits are. We're visually communicating, this is what we did. So here's the wetland, here's a wetland on your property, here's a little bit of a wood lot on your property. We classified this as class 3, we classified this as class 2, and this little piece right here wasn't even flowing into the watershed. We just removed it out of there. But what this does is it allows you to call myself or any of my staff members and say, hey, I have questions. And I have questions specifically about this 40-acre piece right here and how you applied the benefits here. Can you talk me through that? And we're seeing what you're seeing, and it makes it a lot easier to talk about these things. We also, after all of these packets are mailed out, we host a landowner meeting just like this one. I go through this entire spiel again. We get to hear it again. It'll be fun. John won't be there, but I'll be there. I'll go through everything that we did for all the different properties, and anyone who has any questions, we can address them as a group, or we can stay as long as we need to talk to each individual about any questions they might have about their individual parcel. Because right now, all we're doing is talking about this. The watershed district hasn't decided what they're gonna do. We don't know what the benefits are gonna be for every parcel. But once we get to this point, you're going to get in the mail, and it is going to say what your percentage is. On the report, there will be a notional column, it's called, and it's a hypothetical $100,000 repair. If we know what the actual numbers are, what the cost of this is gonna be, we will use that number. But if we don't, we'll use a hypothetical 100,000. And that is the only number I would care about as a landowner, because it says if $100,000 is spent on this system, this is my responsibility. That's what I wanna see on the report. That's what you'll be armed with when you come to the land to talk to us. We can help explain these things to you. Once the landowner meeting is over, there'll be about 6 weeks until the board would have a public hearing. This is all again hypothetical that they even ordered this redetermination. But at the time that they have that public hearing, they would take testimony and the board would decide if they're going to accept the report that we bring forth. And that's where it's going to matter to you guys, because that's where things could change. Benefit rules could be different than they are now. All of those types of things. So when and if you get this landowner with this property owner's packet, I would strongly encourage you to come to the landowner meeting, visit with us, make sure you gain as much understanding as you can. And if you don't, just keep asking questions, because I'll keep talking until you understand it. That's my job. So another thing that John talked about was buffers. So I think a lot of people, think about these buffer strips, and there was a lot of talk about this in 17 and 18, and a lot of people called it Governor Dayton's Law. Rick, I thought he was doing it so his pheasant hunting buddies could go out there and hunt, and that they can't do that, right? They don't have access to it. But anyway, under 103F, it had to be in place by November 1st, 2018, and there was no compensation for it. That's kind of a wrong that gets righted through the redetermination of benefits process too. Everybody who had to give up that easement or that 60.5 foot on each side, which is, help me out here, 2 miles or 2 acres per mile, not 1, 2, right?
2 sides of the ditch.
4. Yeah. So anyway, they had to give up those acres in the name of water quality and to help stabilize the banks, no compensation. 103E drainage law that allows for the compensation, so landowners get paid for this buffer easement, they still own it, it's just an easement. And any time a redetermination has been conducted since 1977, is required that viewers calculate the amount of damage payment and the area for the establishment of the grass rock. So I worked up this little piece here. I think this is kind of important. It's probably an important one for Polk County, really. Because if you look, I bet Polk County's got way more than 920 acres of buffer throughout the entire county. But this was one where we said if the value is, and this is a low value, I would estimate, $3,500 an acre, 920 acres, $3.2 million is what, this was Swift County. This is what was gonna cost the county when we did countywide redetermination of benefits. The buffer was gonna cost that much. Now it's the landowners on the system, pay the landowners on the system for this buffer. So it's the adjacent to the ditch system people who get paid for this, but everybody on the system pays for it. If they waited 1 year and land values went up 10%, it was gonna cost them an additional $322,000. If it went up yet again, one more time, 2 years, 3 years, almost another $750,000 is how much more people were going to pay for that buffer strip just by waiting. Because the buffer strips are not cheap. But like I tell everybody on every presentation I give, they're never gonna be cheaper than they are today. Because I've not seen in my nearly 50 years, land prices dip much. They usually go up and they level, and then they go up and then they level. So I'm thinking that paying for buffers is definitely now is the time to do that. So again, just to reiterate, this is the 40,000 acres who are currently paying for buffer or for repairs and maintenance of the Sandhill ditch system. And these are all the people who are totally, truly utilizing it. Plus this protection area right here. Takeaways, the laws that govern the process have changed a lot in the 68 years that this ditch system has been established. And less than half the people that should be paying benefits are. The buffers have not been paid and they're not getting any cheaper. So John kind of alluded to this, but I gave this when I talked to the Sandhill Watershed, what was it, almost a year ago? First time I talked to you, or 9 months ago, somewhere in that neighborhood. These are the options that they have. They can do nothing. Like John said, long-term doing nothing, there's costs associated with that too. Or they can do repairs, maintenance, and continue to do it the way they have and have the wrong people paying for it. I think it's a matter of time before one of the people in that red box petition for the redetermination to be done. Or they can complete their new redetermination and have the benefit rule correct for any repairs and maintenance moving forward. That is the end of my, my big shtick. Does anybody have any questions for me? Yes,
Go back like 2 slides.
you can.
Now, when you showed like the dollars for pennies benefit over this,
Yeah,
is that purely distance? Because your mathematical equation would distance related, it should be area related because they're all using the same portion of the ditch.
yeah, so it was, that was, for calculating, so these systems right here are contributing or outletting systems. There's actually one right here, here. So all of those ones are gonna get that mathematical equation applied to them because they're a separate public system. They're not the Sandhill ditch system. They're a separate system that uses the Sandhill system as an outlet. But everybody else is just going to get benefits via the classification process that I went through those slides, where it could be based on distance, it could be based on elevation, it's based on 70+ different GIS layers that are applied to that classify that. And typically that classification process takes into account how close you are to the public system. So the public system stops right here. If the public system went all the way back to here, you would see a lot higher benefits in this area because these people are closer access then to the public system that's maintained by all the stakeholders on the system. But right now, because they have so many natural water courses to go through till they get here, there's gonna be some evaporation loss. There's gonna be some, it's referred to as attenuation, but attenuation is just simply, runoff versus storage. So the land has an ability to store some water just within its soil profile. And some of it's going to continue to run off, some of it's gonna get stored, some of it's not. So we're gonna look at those types of aspects to see, like way out here, the acres out here, how much of that water really gets here? How much does it really impact the system? You know what I mean? And that's how we're going to apply percentages to that. And the same with these systems here. You know, I gave you that nice simple mathematical equation. But part of what will go into that behind the scenes is how many miles of natural water course do they use to get there? What type of attenuation loss is there for them? How bad are they really impacting the capacity and maintenance issues of the system? That was a good question.
Brian,
Yes.
after you do that 10 million formula that you just went through,
Yeah.
once they get to the red box, they're using 100% of the ditch, aren't they?
Yeah. This one, because there isn't a bunch of branches like the example I showed, there's just one channel. They're always gonna be the multiplier will always be 100% because they use 100% of the channel. But the difference will be that size comparison. Because, you know, if you look at like, let's just say this system, I don't know what this system's name is. Let's say it's 5,000 acres. 5,000 of 250,000 is really gonna get you down to that fractional amount.
So in the end, the simple math of X% times X%, it's gonna be 100%, because you're using the whole red box. But you are really gonna be diluted in the green by all his reasons.
Give you a job tomorrow, you can explain this for me. Yes.
It's just the further you get away from your ditch, less direct benefits you have for that ditch, so your benefits get less and less and less.
Yeah,
And so those that live right along the actual ditch system have the highest benefit because it can drain directly into the ditch. As you get a mile away, your benefits get less. You get 2 miles away, your benefits get less. You get all the way to the east half of the county, your benefits are that much less, but they're still getting benefits. Whereas now they're not.
yes. Yes, and then what it is closer to the ditch system, like John talked earlier about these land use changes. From cattails to wet meadows or cattails to row crop. That's a market value increase to your property. That's a real dollar and a real value that we can antiquate and apply a number to. But when you look way out on this end, this isn't a market increase. This is a burden that puts an economic burden on the ditch system, causing that capacity to need to be bigger. So it's a different equation. Yes, sir.
So you're evaluating down the 40-acre tract.
Yes.
When it gets sent out to a contributing watershed or county ditch, whatever, you're basically assessing as a whole watershed as one unit. Is it up to that contributing watershed to determine back again a person's benefit, or it gets broke down that 40-acre unit at that point anyway, since it's already been done?
It's a great question. And yes, you're right. So what it does is, let's just say this system right here pays 5%. So $100 is spent here, $5 gets transferred back here. That $5 is paid for by the benefit roll on this system. So each person has a different percentage of that $5. So if it's $5 and don't make me do math here, but if it's $5 and you're 5%, you pay 5% of that $5, April's 10%, she pays 10% of that $5. Thanks for not making me say what that value is.
25 cents and 50 cents.
Thank you.
And that's one of the reasons why the county board has supported the watershed in putting this program together and discussing this, because if the watershed goes forward with redetermining benefits on Sandville ditch, then the county board is going to go ahead and redetermine benefits on all those ditches, which then will bring all those ditches up to 2025 or 2026 values versus 1905 and 1910 dollars.
And there's cost savings too for us to do the work.
Yeah.
If we're doing it all at one time. And to be completely blunt, if we were charging, let's say we're charging $4 an acre to evaluate this area. For each contributing system, we charge half that amount. So if we charge $4 an acre to determine benefits here, we would charge $2 an acre to calculate this system's contributing amount and this system's outlet amount. And if we do the redetermination on that, we charge the full amount, but then at least they get the redetermination. They're up to stuff too. So it's kind of the county could pay half the amount and get nothing, or they could pay the full amount to do the redetermination. And then they have the redetermination done at least. Sand Hill also has the right people paying in for that system.
With greater evaluation, full money, is it such that that can only be used maintenance, or can there then in turn be improvements done since there's more
No, it can only be,
available?
it can only be done on maintenance. If you were gonna improve the ditch, then that's a totally different process.
Proving bigger, deeper, steeper, wider requires an entirely different procedure. So the redetermination is still required if you're doing an improvement because it sets the baseline. And then if you were gonna do an improvement, we would do a determination, it's called, looking at the engineering and knowing what the value increase would be from this proposed improvement. So we'd have basically like a new redetermination of what the values would be, and the delta, the difference between those two reports, would say who's paying for that. Glad you picked that up right away, because I've explained that to a million people, and usually they just give it a glazed over look, so, yeah.
That's scenario, sir. If we go through the rejuvenation, say you're having what he wants. How much of the difference would the unit basis, the main part of that predetermined information that give.
Absolutely, yes, it is step one of an improvement is the redetermination of benefits. I don't want to get deep into it, but okay, very good.
All the improvement will do is bring more lands in at lower elevation.
Just stay at the benefit of that.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
Theoretically, it's cost effective down the road if you had already determined.
And usually when someone wants an improvement, they want it 3 years ago. They're asking for it and they want it right now. And if the redetermination stuff, that's one less year, you're gonna have to wait for that process to be completed. To be able to get rolling on the improvement.
So what does this have as an effect on homeowners as far as the cost?
Like, so when you say homeowner, are you talking about someone who just owns a 5-acre chunk of land that's just their house on it?
Yeah, I mean, I have like 20 acres.
Okay. What
I
would you,
mean, so my biggest thing, because I work on the county level too.
sure,
So I'm looking at it kind of from both ends of what it would affect me as a landowner. But as far as assessing property too, can you only assess like 100%? Or can a county or a ditch assess like 700% of those benefits?
No.
No.
Yes, that's more than total benefits.
Okay.
And typically the total benefits are going to well exceed any assessment, number one. Number two, if it becomes a financial burden, then drainage authority has the ability to spread those assessments out. With the opportunity to go in and prepay if they want. Because typically, if you stay there for 5 years, you're going to interest assessments.
So now Amanda, your parcel is, where,
I'm right on 421 by Walter.
so you're likely already in the assessed area.
I am,
You're in the red.
I am.
she's in the red box.
She's in the red box.
See?
So right now, by predetermining benefits, you're actually, if they spend $1,000 on the ditch, your cost will go down. You got all the.
To extend it in, okay.
And I mean, obviously,
There's gonna be a cost to do this process that you're gonna see, but in the end, your price will go down.
yeah, obviously getting the benefit roll correct costs money.
Right, yeah.
And then the buffer strip gets added into this and kind of throws a little bit of a wrench in it because it's a cost. It's not really the redetermination cost, but it is a cost that comes.
Unless we already have the right of way, then it's something.
Yeah, the buffer's already paid for. You're good. Yeah, if you'd have done it in the 70s, you'd be paying 70 prices for the buffer.
Well, no, I mean, there are some ditches that have like 50 feet of right of way beyond the top of backset. Oh, okay. And so if they already have that right of way and there wasn't a buffer there, but now there is a buffer there, you're not, all you're doing is basically paying for them to plant the grass that's already planted.
Okay, okay.
So there's a lot of different things that go into it, because we just did one up by Delphi. Took us about 3 years to do it, but part of that was COVID related and, we had ditches that went every direction, had their own system to them. So we cleaned all that up, predetermined benefits, now we got 2 systems. And, a lot of the ditches already had enough right of way. A lot of the ditches already had grass planted, those nature areas. And so the damages weren't that big, and so we were able to redetermine benefits for pennies on the dollar.
So it's between April and Rich. How many ditches or miles of ditch or percentage of the watershed has been redetermined in the last 30 years?
From the Sandhill Watershed District perspective, all of them,
Project 17?
well, they've all been done since the early 2000s. They're all up to date, or what we would consider up to date, except for this system here. We just recently did the incremental buffer on ditch 9. But we acquired the buffer that way.
Sure, you made a bunch, but so everything else is.
This is
just-
watershed district one.
is
Now,
just a
Richard's
itty
side,
bitty-
Not. So all the county ditches within the Sandhill River watershed district have not had benefits redetermined on since the original. So.
By and large, that is the case in Minnesota. We are doing whole counties that we're doing redeterminations on. Because they're so out of date. I mean, we visited with, Meeker County. They have a ditch system that was established in 1886 and has not been redetermined since then. That's shortly after Lincoln was assassinated. That is like 40 years before most homes even had power.
It's was built and they were assessed.
Right,
I
that
know
was it.
people will start.
Yeah.
we're fortunate, 'cause most of the watershed district ditches are fairly new.
Yeah, from improvements there.
Yeah, we were sure this was just a couple, when we did project 17, but
You guys have something. you wanna do?
Zach's gonna look at serving.
All right, so just as a reminder, my name's Zach Norman. I work with Houston Engineering and I serve as a district engineer for the Sandhill Watershed District. And we'll go through this fairly quickly here, but we did want to highlight a few things the district has had going on and things that are coming up within the Sandhill Watershed District that are pertinent to the Sandhill Ditch. So first off, this is a map you saw from Brian's presentation, but essentially what this shows is a map of the Sandhill Watershed District. The extents are this kind of yellow and red dashed line that you see here, but then all the area that contributes to it is kind of all an aerial photo that's not kind of grayed out that you see. Like Brian mentioned, roughly 250,000 acres. Essentially, the Sandhill Ditch serves as an outlet for, close to 80% of our overall watershed district area. It is mentioned a few times now, but it is a 103E legal drainage system managed by the Sandhill River Watershed District. You can see on the map here that the extents start a few miles to the south of Climax, go upstream through Beltrami, east of Beltrami, kind of up to Beech Ridge, and starts kind of right where Kittleson Creek enters into the Sandhill River is where the legal extents of the Sandhill Ditch reside. So there's been a number of enhancements that the watershed district has been involved with along the Sandhill Ditch. So maybe just a little background on the ditch system first. Like was mentioned in John's presentation, Construction was completed in 1956. It was actually a federal flood control project that was constructed by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. They started looking at a project here, I think in the 1940s, kind of took some time, obviously, and it got to the point where they built it between 54 and 56. You know, the project was built for a purpose, like Brian showed in some of his graphics, to provide flood damage reduction benefits and make land more productive towards the more towards the western portion of the watershed district. And it was successful in that. However, since it's been completed, there's been a lot of issues that have kind of plagued the ditch system. So you see a few listed up there, things like failing channel side slopes, turbid waters from a water quality standpoint, impacts to recreation along the Sandhill Ditch, all different types of things like that. We've tried to be proactive again in kind of addressing some of those issues, and we'll go through a few example projects here just to show you, not only along the Sandhill Ditch, but also areas in the Sandhill River upstream of the Sandhill Ditch, because it is, that whole area contributes to the system. So issues that occur further up in the watershed certainly do have an impact within the ditch system itself. So first, just to get into what some of the issues are along the Sandhill Ditch. And some of you that are familiar with the ditch system, this won't be anything new to you. But what this screen is showing is the Sandhill Ditch, particularly in the Beltrami area and to the east, but we see that kind of also throughout other areas of the system. It's most pronounced in that area. The channel was originally constructed to be a trapezoidal channel. You can see the red line showing what the original channel geometry looked like. One of the major issues that we've had along the ditch system is that the channel was cut at a grade line that's proven to be unstable for the type of soils that it's going to. Essentially meaning it's too steep for the soils that exist out there. It's led to a lot of channel down cutting or erosion out of the bottom of the channel because the water just moves too quickly. As the bottom of that channel fails, the side slopes tend to also fail with it because you're taking the toe away and it kind of sloughs in. All that sediment and everything is then transported further downstream. So if you look on the screen, what this is showing is if you were to take the ditch and almost like just slice vertically right through it and split it open and look at a cross-section view of it, the blue line shows about where it's eroded to. These cross sections actually, I believe, were taken in about 2016. So it's about 8 years old already. We're seeing continued channel movement. But just to give you an idea of kind of the dramatic, how much bigger and wider the system got. You see in certain areas, we've had 8 to 10 feet or more of down cutting. As it cuts down, the channel continually gets wider, encroaches on private property, causes a lot of public safety issues with adjacent to public transportation. All issues that the watershed district's been trying to work to address. So just a few kind of pictures. These are just example photos. There's locations throughout the system where we've seen failures like this occurring. These two pictures are kind of the same slough at just two different angles, but essentially, you know, you can see that bank failure. This was just last spring, I believe, is when we took these photos. We've got a lot of erosion on the toe of the bank that's leading to those banks to continue to fail, and they're continuing to be actively failing throughout the Sandhill Ditch reach. Like we'll go on a few examples here. We're trying to be proactive using grant funds or outside funds where we can to try and address sort of the worst areas. But there is kind of a bigger need throughout the ditch system itself. First one I'll get into is we call it the low water crossing. It's right at the Reese-Scandia Township line. So just to the west of Beltrami. Essentially at this location, there was a bridge that was built as part of the origination of the project. The bridge got to be unsafe to get across with traffic. There was still a need there to get across the river. There was also a lot of concerns there in terms of, well, how will this crossing be paid for? Obviously, a new bridge is an expensive feature to add. We did recognize that the Sandhill Ditch is a DNR of public waters as well, and there's a desire to see fish passage and things like that through the structure. We were able to work with the state to get outside funding sources to put a low water crossing in to both address the need from the local perspective to be able to get across the river at the location, as well as addressing concerns with more environmentally focused issues that allow for outside funding to pick up kind of the bulk of the cost for this crossing. Another site, and this is one that's not on the Sandhill Ditch, but certainly one of those that has potential to impact the Sandhill Ditch further downstream. This is, we call this the West Mill site. Essentially, it's where the mill used to be, just to the west of Fertile. at the location. The mill was having a lot of, it was a retired mill that was having, stability issues with the essentially the structure that was on the Sandhill River. What this project did, you know, rather than having an issue that maybe would lead to large amounts of erosion continuing downstream and causing problems further in the Sandhill ditch, what this project did was remove the structure at issue and replaced it with a series of rock riprap grade control structures that helped to ensure that we didn't get erosion through the reach there essentially. And like I said, it's not in the Sandhill ditch, but really led to a solution that reduced sediment getting into the ditch system. Kind of bouncing back onto the Sandhill ditch system now. So this is a project the watershed district was more kind of involved with secondarily, but the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers actually came back to the project. I believe they began planning in 2000, probably around 2010 in that area. Essentially what they wanted to do is they call it an ecosystem restoration project. So, you know, through this reach of the Sandhill ditch system, just from Beltrami and to the east, there were 4 concrete drop structures that were installed to provide some grade control. I say a concrete drop structure, it's essentially, you can think of it like a structure that the water can drop vertically in an effort to along the channel and then release it back into the channel. What the Corps of Engineers program did was came in and they left the drop structures in place. They cut the wing walls off of those drop structures and then installed riprap from kind of the top of the drop structure at a moderate grade. So the top of the drop structure would be roughly in this area and then down at a moderate grade into the ditch system. The whole, their kind of primary intent there was to facilitate fish passage through the structure. That work was funded 75% federally. The state picked up the remaining 25% through a state funding source that was geared toward these type of projects. And like I say, the watershed district was kind of involved, maybe one step back on this and served as kind of the local funding partner where some of that state funds were ushered through for match against the federal grant. So that work was all completed in 2016. Other things that have gone on in the Sandhill ditch, in an effort to at least slow the erosion and some of the channel down cutting, we've installed 34 rock drop structures throughout the system, and this was all done collaboratively with West Polk SWCD, as well as a multitude of other funding partners that you'll see on the final slide here. But essentially what we did was we put lower rock drops, 34 of them, throughout the areas of worst head cutting along the Sandhill ditch. The effort there was to try and stabilize the channel from not down cutting any further. And we have had some success with that with these structures, but part of the problem is there's just been so much erosion that's occurred since the ditch originated that those side slopes are so unstable that they're just continuing to fail and slush. So while these are helping to slow future down cutting, we do still have that existing issue with the banks of the Sandhill ditch system. So these projects were largely funded, I believe they were almost 100% outside funding. If I remember correctly, these projects here. And just a couple more to hit on, you know, when we got through with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers project, we had a lot of extra grant funds left over that allowed us to kind of take those funds and look at other things that needed to be done. One big thing related to the Sandhill ditch at the very upstream end of it. For those that are familiar with the area, there's the Kittleson Creek enters into the Sandhill ditch at the very upper end of the Sandhill ditch system. At that location, there was a culvert there that was causing a lot of issues. Number one, it was set too high for the river channel. Number two, the banks were very, very steep, so it was kind of a public safety issue going off the shoulder of the township road at that location. And then number three, that area actually served as kind of a fairly popular snowmobile area from what I'm told. So, you know, people were having to kind of jump up onto the township road and then jump back down into the ditch at that location. So what we did is this was working again with some of the state funding. We also worked with the county on this one pretty closely to secure some bridge funds for the crossing itself. We were able to replace that structure. Kind of an old borderline rusted out culvert was there before, metal pipe. Replaced it with a box culvert. So because of that, we were able to bring in that outside funding. And then it's a structure that will be part of the system kind of into the future that reduce maintenance costs at that location. And then this last one that I'll show, just jump to the next slide to show you. This one's quite a ways away from the Sandhill ditch itself. On the Sandhill River, east up towards Sandhill Lake. At the outlet of Sandhill Lake, there's there historically was a sheet pile structure, or basically steel sheets that are pushed into the ground to control the lake level coming out of Sandhill Lake. So there were a lot of issues with that through time, where it was suspected that it was heaving and moving around quite a bit with frost heave and things like that in the spring. It was quite the issue from a property owner perspective around the lake. It was also an issue from a DNR perspective, because a big thing with the DNR is trying to restore the ability for fish to migrate up and down the Sandhill River, including in and out of Sandhill Lake. So what that led to was what you see on the screen here. Basically, this is a rock chute that is at a moderate enough grade that fish can migrate up and down this channel. The old sheet pile is actually buried at about this, actually it's probably a little more over in this location right here. But this local perspective, it kind of reduced the issue with the property owner concern with lake level management because of this floating sheet pile structure that used to be in place. And then also because it addressed the fish passage issue, this was covered nearly 100% by the state of Minnesota to install the structure itself. So just wanted to kind of show you these things along the Sandhill ditch. You know, this isn't just in the Sandhill ditch, but kind of throughout the Sandhill River watershed, because they all do kind of lend themselves into what contributes and what causes issues as we get further down to the Sandhill ditch system itself. Last one, sorry, this is the last one I'll hit on here, but just to the south of Pearl here, this actually was the last one that we did as well with grant funds, but some of you may remember where Highway 32 used to cross the Sandhill River just straight south of town before it was realigned years ago. There was a bridge that was still in place there. We call it the Poisson Bridge, but it's the old Highway 32 crossing across the Sandhill River. That bridge was essentially abandoned by MnDOT, turned over to the landowner. The landowner had used it kind of for private access and things like that. People from the community would come out and take pictures, and it was a fairly scenic old metal bridge. But what happened was, with some of the flooding that we've had, is we had issues with failure around the bridge itself, causing public safety issues, as well as some encroachment on the channel that created some issues with from an environmental perspective as well. So we used funds that were left over from some of these prior grant funds to go in, and we actually removed the bridge. So you can see this crane, the bridge was removed and set off to a separate location where it could still be used by the community. And then as part of removing that public safety risk, we also then went in here and installed a rock riprap chute. And really, this was the piece that we were able to tie to the removal of the bridge that allowed us to use the grant funds for that, to get that structure just out of the way, install kind of a hardened channel to reduce erosion moving further back. Over to April.
Yep, so I just kind of wanted to talk to you guys just for a little bit about all of the things that the watershed district's been doing over the years, and what those really cost. So I went back and went through all of the books and found that we'd spent, or that a total of $3.2 million was received through grants and partnerships for all of the projects that Zach just talked about. And I thought it was important to highlight that under $10,000 was spent locally using an ad valorem tax to help contribute for the local share for that. And for those of you in the red area on the map, $0 was spent out of that assessed area. So we were really able to be creative and to work really, really hard to get grant dollars from the state and the federal government. And we couldn't do it alone. You know, we had tons of partners sitting at the table. Some contributed with in-kind, just different assistance that they provided. A lot of the bigger state funding with SARD-SAMS, all of that would contribute to that $3.2 million. Also, for this area, we do have quite a bit secured coming forward. In 2022, there was the spring flood, and FEMA had come forward with dollars. We'd asked for $1.7 million in damages. Initially, we were denied that. We applied for an appeal, and we just heard this spring that
That has been granted and we do have 1.7, at least 1.7 million earmarked for the damages that were done through that 2022 flood. We have about $1 million earmarked through the HSEM to repair the 2023 damages. And there's a spot on Liberty Township and one out in Scandia Township. And both of those are about a 75-25 cost share for that. We have secured about $125,000 of the local share through our One Watershed, One Plan dollars. So that will be very minimal expense through the ad valorem. And then the last one, we've secured about $252,000 through our One Watershed, One Plan for what we're calling the Sandhill River ecosystem. And that's going to be an ongoing thing. We have a project team established, and that's important because this project team is really all of our stakeholders, agency folk. It's consisted of landowners. It has township officials on it. And it's a really big group of people who will sit down at the table and will start at the very front end for permitting and for things that, would get to us to alternatives to address some of the issues that Zach had talked about. And then with that, we have about $10,000 from the flood damage reduction work group. So we have a lot of funding that is coming up. We've been able to get a lot of grants in the past. I don't foresee that to change. And I think that's still going to be a goal of the watershed district, is to keep really, really working hard at getting these grants and outside funding sources coming in. So our next step is, what is next and why are you here today? I think, our watershed district board has had years worth of experience in learning from education. And that's why we've asked for this today, to kind of bring you up to where we're at, the education process about what that might look like and what the statutory requirements are and what the viewing process looks like. And so our board has just asked for all landowners, they really, really want your feedback. What do you think? What do you think of the presentations? What do you think the next step should be? What do you think is fair? What do you think is equitable? All those questions. We do have a paper copy to get your feedback. If you're more comfortable, on our website, probably tomorrow or the next day, we'll have an online submission link on there so you can fill out your comments and your feedback online. We'd like all of the feedback by October 3rd, or we'd like to review it at the October 3rd meeting. So if you could get it to us by September 30th, that would be great. And all of your comments would be on record. And our board just really, really wants to have that feedback. So that's why you're here today, is to get educated about what the process looks like, what the watershed board visions they have for the future. So I don't know if you have any other questions. We have the attorney still here, so if you have questions, now's the time. But Stuart, if you want to take it over from here. Yeah. We can kind of stick around a little bit afterwards too.
You guys need a few minutes to pull out any questions or? Okay, names to our presenters today. We'll find which language, represent both of them. Like April said, feel free to contact Watershed if there's any legal questions.
Oh, yeah, if everybody didn't sign the sign-in sheet, please do that so we can keep a permanent record of who's here. And a recording of the meeting will also be on our website. I think I put that on the invitation that got sent out, but.
But in the near future, if you still have questions for Cole or Ryan, go through it.
Yes, it's.
And she can answer. Thank you for coming. Thank you for having an interest in this education.